Good evening. We are going to begin talking about Buddhism now at this point in the semester. And we're going to start off with just a little bit of the background about the Buddha's life. According to the story, he was the son of a ruler. And of course, we know that Buddhism was founded where? No, not China. In India. In India. And when? Well, right smack in the middle of the axial age, right? Which puts it about 2,500 years ago. Alrighty. And so what religion then is the Buddha born into? Well, that of course would be Hinduism. Certainly Buddhism doesn't exist when he's born, does it? So, in India, in the axial age, in Hinduism, and we already know from the Hinduism lectures before that Buddhism and Jainism are two new axial age religions that actually have a little bit of a conflict with Hinduism. They don't accept the caste system and a lot of the teachings of Hinduism. And we've mentioned this before, and so now you're going to learn a lot more about what Buddhism teaches and what kind of beliefs in Hinduism the Buddha does not really agree with. So let's start out with his childhood. Now there's lots of neat stories about his childhood and supernatural events that herald the coming of some kind of a great spiritual leader. And I don't need you to know all of those, but there's one story I would like you to know because I think it's instructive. There is a sage, a seer, a prophet, a soothsayer, a wise man, whatever you want to call him, that comes to Siddhartha's father, who is the Raja, who is the ruler, and gives him a prophecy that his son is either going to be a great ruler or a great religious leader. And what does Siddhartha's father want him to be? Well, obviously a great ruler. He doesn't want him to run off and get involved with some religious sect. Siddhartha's father finally has his crown prince and certainly wants to raise him up to be a good ruler. So this prophecy disturbs Siddhartha's father, and so he takes steps to make sure that his fear that Siddhartha would choose to be a religious leader rather than a great ruler is not realized. And what he does is he cloisters his son, another word for secluding his son. His son is really not allowed to leave the palatial compound very often. And by the way, this isn't like being locked up. I'm sure his father has a great deal of land, and Siddhartha has plenty of room to do whatever he wants to do, and all of his needs are met very, very nicely. So he has no reason to feel like he is in any way being deprived. Never has to go out and run to 7-Eleven at 3 o'clock in the morning for something. Anyway, this seems like maybe a good decision, but not really. The problem is very simple, and that is Siddhartha his entire life never really sees how the vast majority of the population live, the regular people. He sees life from the point of view of someone who is very privileged. And so he does not understand the challenges and the suffering of the common people. He's never seen them, never experienced them. And there's a problem with this, and you can probably already see what it's going to be, and that is he's never sufficiently disillusioned to the sufferings of the common people. So when he finally sees them, it's traumatic for him. Well, anyway, let me finish telling the story, and then I will come back to maybe what would have been a better idea for his father. As Siddhartha is getting older and probably becoming a co-regent, probably starting to have some responsibilities for governing along with his father, although his father is still king, he becomes more interested in the kingdom that he is going to be taking over and realizes he hasn't seen it. And so he enlists the help of his faithful chariot driver to take him out and give him a tour of the land he's going to be taking over. Now, of course, he does this without letting his father know. Dad would not at all be approving of this particular endeavor forth. But the chariot driver probably realizes, hey, this guy's going to be the king someday, so I'll be his confidant now. It'll probably be good for me later on. Anyway, Siddhartha gets taken on a tour of the land, and while he is on this tour, he sees what we call the 4 passing sights. And sometimes people will title them somewhat differently, but the 4 passing sights is the way I've usually heard them titled. And this isn't because the sights were passing, but because Siddhartha sees them in passing, as he's being taken on this tour in his chariot. Now, by the way, there are different versions of some of the stories, whether all these sights happened in one trip or whether he took 4 different trips, or it really doesn't matter. The point is still the same. And there will be different stories I'll be telling you that if you've heard a slightly different version, you'll see that the point of the story is still the same, even if there are slightly different details. It's funny how that works out. Anyway, so when he is out on this journey, the first sight that he sees, I'm going to put myself down in the corner over here, so that you can see the 4 passing sights. The first sight that he sees is an extremely old man, very frail, very decrepit is a good adjective there. Now, first of all, has Siddhartha ever seen an old man before? Well, yeah, of course. I mean, his father's probably old. Most of his teachers are probably graybeards. I mean, most of the wise men, the counselors, and so on are. So, yes, he's seen age, but not like this. This guy is probably so frail, he looks like if a gust of wind came by, it would blow him right over, and he'd probably break half his bones when he hit the ground. And Siddhartha has never seen anyone this old and this frail. And so this really kind of rocks him to the core. I mean, and again, you know, most people would not be so taken aback by this, but most people are not as sheltered as a poor, rich, privileged boy Siddhartha is. And the next sight that he sees is a man with a loathsome disease. And loathsome is a good word. What does it mean to loathe something? It's more than just hating it. You despise it. It's just, you can't bear it. And when you talk about a loathsome disease, there's usually 3 characteristics. First of all, it's ugly. It's hard to look at. Secondly, it's extremely contagious. In fact, traditionally, this has usually been thought of as some form of leprosy in an advanced state where Siddhartha is literally seeing someone with their skin rotting off their body. And so this is highly contagious, and you've probably heard in centuries past, before there was any kind of cure or treatment, that people who had leprosy were exiled from the community, and they lived in leper colonies by themselves so they wouldn't infect other people. And thirdly, this is incurable. It's going to be a terminal disease. It's going to kill you. There's no way to stop it. So when you think loathsome, think this. Don't just think of a guy that's sick. You know, Siddhartha's seen sickness before. I'm sure somebody in his family, you know, has got a cold or got the flu or something, but he has never seen anything like someone's flesh rotting off their body. And again, this just stuns him because he's not desensitized to this. He's never even thought about anything like this before. So this is like the worst horror movie he's ever seen at this point. The next thing that he sees is even worse. On the side of the road, he sees a corpse that is decomposing. Now, it's only been on the side of the road for a few days, okay? There are a couple versions of the story. One version of the story, he sees the corpse. Another version of the story, he actually sees the corpse as it's being picked up to be disposed of. But in any case, it's been by the side of the road for a few days. Why would that happen? Well, apparently the man died away from his family, or else he didn't have any. They didn't know where he was at. And either his family finally found him, or some governor of the region told a family of untouchables to get out there and take that body and go burn it. But in any case, this man has been dead just long enough to where you can see the first signs of decomposition. He doesn't look like a sleeping guy made to look real pretty in his casket or something. And by the way, Siddhartha's probably seen something like that. Seems inconceivable that nobody in the royal family has died during his entire life. I'm sure he's seen a funeral with a lot of pomp and splendor, and the corpse, of course, is made to look as lifelike as you can, you know, as if it's peacefully sleeping. And maybe he's seen something like this, but nothing in any state of decomposition, and just left as if there's no meaning in the man's death at all. And so this is crushing to Siddhartha. He just does not understand this. Now, let's talk about this a little bit before we go on to the 4th sight, because, you know, his father made this decision to seclude him thinking this would be the best thing, and you already see why it's a bad idea, because Siddhartha was never desensitized to these things. And so this reminds me of a couple things. First off, I don't know if you're familiar with Greek tragedies, Greek classic literature and stage plays and so on. But in many of these ancient stories, there are prophecies involved, and they usually come from some kind of sibyl at an oracle or something like that. And in the days that the Greek tragedies were written, these prophecies sometimes come as riddles, and you have to figure them out, and they'll only do you any good if you can actually figure out the true meaning of them. And there's another aspect of them too, and that is that some of these things are not assumed to be fate per se. It is possible that if you react to them in the right way, you might be able to prevent the bad thing from happening. Sounds good, right? The problem is, and this is why they call some of these stories tragedies, is these prophecies are almost self-fulfilling. The fact of the matter is, the people that receive the prophecies, in endeavoring to make choices that will cause them not to occur, actually end up making them occur. And so if the person had never received the prophecy, the person would have never taken the steps that caused the prophecy to happen, even though the person was trying to prevent it. And probably one of the greatest examples of this is, well, in my opinion, one of the greatest tragedies of all time, Oedipus Rex. So if you would like to check that out, that'll give you a real good crash course in Greek tragedy. So it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, why am I telling you this? Because in a sense, this is what Siddhartha's father, the king, has done. He has caused what he feared the worst to come upon him by trying to prevent it. He made a bad decision about how to prevent it. Second thing I'll mention here, I said two things came to mind, remember? I'm adopted. And I have a sister who's also adopted. We're not related to each other. We were adopted separately by the same adoptive parents. And we never had a problem with that because we were told when we were very small children that we were adopted. In fact, I think I was told I was adopted before I was really quite able to understand it. But I don't know how far your memories go back. I have a couple from like age 3 and maybe a couple from age 4 or 5. But I really start remembering things once I'm going to school and I'm in first grade. And I remember telling another boy in my first grade class, Mrs. McKelvey's class, I even remember the teacher's name, but I was explaining to this other little boy what it meant to be adopted because he'd never heard the term, and I was explaining to him, well, it means that, my mommy and my daddy aren't my real mommy and daddy because something happened to them, and they couldn't raise me. So anyway, so I remember explaining this. Never had a problem with it at all because we were told early, and we never went through any crisis of identity and never felt the need to go out and, I've got to find out who I am and find my family. And, later, much later on in life, in fact, fairly recently, I actually did track down my birth mother just because I was curious and my adopted mother had finally died. And a story for later, perhaps. But anyway, have you known anyone whose parents adopted the child? And this is the thinking of the parents. The parents thought, well, we love our child so much. And we love our child just as much as if this was our own child, We don't love this child any less because the child is adopted. And we do not want this child to feel inferior in any way, shape, or form. So we're not even going to tell the child that the child is adopted. Now, the reasoning at first sounds kind of noble, doesn't it? But it's also kind of foolish. Because have you known anyone who, say in their late teenage years or early adulthood, found out for the first time that they were adopted? Did they take it well? And the answer is always, no, they did not. The fact they've gone through their whole life not knowing this, and they finally find out when they're in at least the young stages of adulthood, it's beyond disillusioning. It's a tragedy. And a lot of them feel like, oh my God, my whole life has been a lie. I don't even know who I am. And they'll sometimes quit school or quit a job and leave their family and try to figure out who the heck they are because this is a crisis. By the way, it can also kind of ruin your relationship with your adopted family for a while. You feel like you've been lied to your whole life, Easter Bunny, Santa Claus, and the Tooth Fairy, and now this. How can I ever trust you anymore, right? So, if you ever adopt children, tell them. When they're 4 years old, just go, I'm so glad I adopted you. I love you so much. And they'll grow up having no problem with it at all. They'll never have to go through that crisis of disillusionment and then this deep search to figure out who they are. Well, so anyway, just a little bit more perspective on why this is so crushing to Siddhartha, because some people don't understand it. It's like, yeah, I understand this is like a problem, but why would it devastate him? if you don't know these things exist and you've never experienced them, it would be kind of devastating. I sometimes ask my students, have you ever, had an experience where for the first time you find a dead body that's partially decomposing? And every now and then I'll get a student that says yes, and obviously it's a very, very horrible event. In fact, when you see something like that, the vast majority of people, the first reaction is they just start violently heaving, throwing up. And so now, again, if there's someone who is in a profession where this is part of their profession, maybe they're like a CSI or something like that, and they're dealing with, human remains all the time, well, this just becomes like a job to them. There was a movie a number of years ago, not the TV series remake, but a movie called Fargo, where in the early scenes of the movie, there's a fatality on the side of the road, and the sheriff or police chief, I can't remember her title, happens to be a woman who is also very, very, very pregnant. And she comes out and she's seeing the dead body there, and she goes, "Excuse me," and turns away and throws up briefly. And someone says something to the effect of, "Oh, I know it's kind of ugly." She goes, "Oh, no. She goes, "It's morning sickness." Had to do with her pregnancy. So Siddhartha would have been fine if he had just known this existed, but he didn't. So now he's devastated. And what is the fourth sight that he sees? He sees a peaceful monk. Now, this is interesting because this monk, I'll tell you some other things about the monk, and I haven't put them up here on the board because what I want you really to remember here is peaceful. That's key. And you'll see why. But there's some other terms you could use too. Ascetic is one. That's spelled A-S-C-E-T-I-C. And an ascetic is someone who is denying themselves the comforts of this life because they do not want to get attached to those things or need them, because they stand in the way of the spiritual quest that this person is on. So when you think of monks and nuns and hermits and people on some kind of a deeper spiritual, psychophysical discipline or something, they're often very ascetic. They're not going to have televisions, they're not going to drive cars, they're not going to have bank accounts. And so this is an example of a monk, and all he really has are the clothes on his back and what's called his begging bowl. Now, let me explain that just a little bit, because there's no shame in this at all. In Indian culture, and by the way, in other cultures, especially in Southeast Asia and Far East Asia, common people, what we call the laity, are supposed to support the communities of the monks and the nuns if they exist. And one of the things they do is the monks come out every morning with their begging bowls, and the common people come out and put prepared food in their bowls and feed them, because the monks don't have kitchens, they don't store food, none of that. And but this is the community's job, and they believe they experience a great benefit having the sangha, or the community of monks, in their midst, and so they take care of them, and that is what they're supposed to do. So anyway, this monk is out there with just the clothes on his back and his begging bowl, doesn't have anybody else with him, he's not a guru, he's not leading any other group of people, doesn't have any friends with him or anything, and he apparently has taken a vow of wandering. So he, at this point, is a wandering monk. Now, people will do this during the months of the year that have the better climates. Obviously, as they're very inclement months, you would probably stay in one place. But the idea is, in trying to break attachment, you can get very attached to the place where you sleep every night. So some monks feel like it's necessary to go through a period of time where they actually renounce having a regular place to sleep. And so they will be constantly traveling. So this is a wandering monk. It's an ascetic monk. And but these are not the characteristics or the adjectives related to this monk that really impress Siddhartha. What impresses Siddhartha is this monk is at peace. This monk clearly has some kind of peace within, some kind of contentment. This monk is in some internal way detached from the suffering all around him. And this suffering is not causing him any internal existential conflict or discomfort. This is very interesting because at this point, if there's anybody in this scene so far, the common people with all the suffering and Siddhartha and the monk, Siddhartha's sitting in his wonderful chariot, and he can drive back to his palatial compound right now, and he'll never have to see any of this again if he doesn't want to. And if there's anybody in this scene right now that should be happy or should have some kind of peace, it seems like it should be Siddhartha, right? And yet Siddhartha is the one that is going through the most extreme existential crisis right now. And right in the middle of this suffering is a monk that has nothing. has no reason to have any advantage over anyone else, has less than most people, and yet he is at peace, is not suffering, is content. A content monk. And that's what impresses Siddhartha, that he is right in the middle of this suffering, and yet he is content. And this puts this question in Siddhartha's mind. I mean, the question is just, suffering? But this really adds something to it, the fact that here's someone with nothing going for him that, can be observed or quantified, qualified, or whatever, and yet he seems to be doing just fine. Now, a couple other things I want to point out, and this is important. He's peaceful, he's at peace, he's content. If you understand more what enlightenment is, and you use the term detached, for instance, I'd give it to you. But let's just talk in terms of, layman's terms now, okay? What we do not want to say is you would not want to tell me it was a happy monk. You'll get that wrong every time. Now, I understand that we change the meaning of words all the time. And when I'm not teaching, I'm not maniacal. I'm not the grammar police or the word usage police. I don't torment my friends by correcting them. But since you're my students and I have to teach you, I want to point out that happiness, by definition, is a temporary emotional response to situations outside of your control. It is temporary, and it is an emotional response to situations outside of your control. So if situations outside of your control are favorable to you, then there's a good emotional response. Of course, it's temporary because the same situations that made you happy are going to change. But if the situations change in such a way that you would not want them to happen, then you have a negative emotional response. We call that unhappiness. Now think about this. How close are the words happy and happen? How close are the words happening and happiness? Does that make sense? Happiness is an emotional response to a happening that is, number one, temporary, and number two, due to forces outside of your control. So do not use the word happy here. Don't do it. This is not a temporary state that this monk is in. This is a permanent state. This is a state the monk lives in, and whatever's happening outside him is not challenging this state, nor is it causing this state. He's not just having a good day because, his wife made his toast just right. He is not responding to anything around him that is giving him happiness. This is an inner state of contentment and peace. So again, peaceful, at peace, content. And secondly, he's a monk. Don't call him a guru. It doesn't say he's leading any other monks. Don't call him a priest. He's definitely not doing rituals or sacrifices or anything. But you got to tell me something more than he's just a man. You've got to tell me something to let me know he's a renunciant. He's renounced his place in society to pursue a higher spiritual goal. Another word for him that you have learned in Hinduism is sannyasin. There's another term that you're learning right now, and it's sadhu. And this is often has to do with wandering monks, but often sannyasin and sadhu are almost interchangeable in many situations. You could just call him a holy man. And a word from the English language, actually, is a mendicant. I guess a couple generations before us, it was used a lot, but many of my students will be like, I've never heard that word before. And I don't blame you. I know it exists, but I can't remember the last time I've heard anyone use it. So one of those words that's kind of fallen into disuse. But any of these are correct. But don't just tell me it's a man, and don't throw some kind of religious title on him that doesn't apply. I want you to understand, this is an ordinary man perhaps, but he has made a renunciant vow, and his life is centered around this goal to pursue some kind of spiritual harmony and inner peace. And guess what? He seems to have found it, or he's very far on the way to finding it, and this really impresses Siddhartha. So Siddhartha goes home in turmoil inside, not knowing what to do about this, and yet he doesn't have to live in it or see it, but he can't forget what he's seen. And as he remembers all of these things that have shaken him to the core, he also remembers this peaceful monk right in the middle of it all that has this perfect peace within. Where does he get that from? So this is Siddhartha's problem right now. Well, what ends up happening is after a period of time, Siddhartha just can't take it anymore. He has to figure out the mystery of suffering. So one night, while his wife and his young son are sleeping, young son, by the way, how blessed is this guy? He's already got his own crown prince, and he's not even king yet. but he kisses his wife and his son goodbye while they're sleeping and leaves the palatial compound never to return. And the first thing that he does is he disciples himself to apparently a well-known guru, or a very enlightened guru. And again, we'd be talking about Jnana Yoga. Remember, we talked about the different spiritual paths in Hinduism just in the last couple of lectures there. And he learns a lot. I mean, he's a smart guy. He's had the best teachers all of his life, so, he's capable of learning a lot. And however much he's learned, it doesn't really solve his problem. It doesn't show him better how to have peace in the midst of suffering, or maybe just doesn't help him practically to be able to incorporate that in his life, however much he learns. So he realizes that just sheer learning, or the discipline of learning can't be what it is. It must be more than that. So he thinks to the austerity of this monk, and he thinks, well, it must be a more austere lifestyle that's necessary. Austere is very similar to ascetic in that sense, in the sense that we're using it right now. So what he does is he joins a group of monks. There are 6 of them with Siddhartha, and he's actually with them for 6 years. And I don't think there's any significance to the fact that it's 6 months or 6 years. So, and as he is with these other monks who are seeking the same thing, who are seeking this enlightenment, this peace, deep inner peace, as they go year after year after year without finding what they're looking for, they continually become more and more ascetic. And it goes from a mild asceticism or a modest asceticism to what we would call a severe asceticism. And by the way, in many religions, we have stories of severe asceticism throughout the centuries. You might have heard something like that. One thinks of immediately thinks of the Christian monks in the Middle Ages, who would, for instance, walk around with a whip, whipping themselves on their backs. We call it self-flagellating, because they thought somehow they were getting some kind of benefit out of this. And sometimes they'd go for a long time without a shower. They'd wear burlap for clothes. A lot of you don't even know what burlap is, because we have these thick plastic trash bags that we can use nowadays to take out the lawn trash or whatever. But when I was a kid, if you were dealing with lawn trash, sticks and stuff like that, you had burlap bags. And, look it up if you don't know what it is. In the Old Testament of the Christian Bible, or also what's the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, they call it sackcloth. And the reason they call it sackcloth is because sacks were made out of it, because it was strong. It's like hemp-like fibers, like what's twisted together to make rope. But anyway, it's really scratchy. And sometimes they'd wear this, and of course it would scratch your skin completely raw to where it would be bleeding, but you'd finally develop these calluses to where you could handle it. And I mean, they do all kinds of stuff like this. They'd fast for like weeks. The idea was that somehow they're breaking the attachment with all of these other concerns that they have in this life, because they think that the attachment to these things is somehow keeping them from their spiritual goal. So anyway, let's apply this back to Siddhartha here, because what happens with him is they get more and more ascetic, and finally, at the end of the 6-year period, and something's getting ready to happen now, as you'll know, but at the end of the 6-year period, they're actually trying to live on 1 grain of rice a day, according to the story. And so you already know this is not going to go on for long, and it's not going to turn out well. Anyway, Siddhartha is out one morning, and I guess all of them are out, doing what they do in the morning, and I'm not sure what they're looking for. They might be out with their bowls going, I just need 1 grain of rice, please. So many questions you could ask about the story. But at any rate, Siddhartha is walking by this body of water on one side, a pond, a canal, whatever, and he passes out. He's just so anemic, he passes out, falls in the water, could have drowned, but the water kind of wakes him up a little bit. And there's also a village woman who's come out with a bowl full of food to feed the monks. And she sees Siddhartha and helps him, and also chides him a little bit and says, what are you trying to accomplish by this? I mean, is this helping you in some way, to be so weak you can't even walk? And at this point, Siddhartha is coming to the same conclusion. He is seeing here, after 6 years of this, just that it's worthless. I mean, it wasn't through intellect, through the learning he went through, but it isn't through this ascetic discipline either. Neither of these things have led him to what he sought. And so he's persuaded by the woman. He actually sits down, takes a bowl of porridge from her, or a bowl of rice, depending what story you hear, and sits down and eats it and is strengthened. And his 5 friends from his Sangha, his group of monks, come and see him either eating or after he's eating the bowl of porridge. Maybe he's got food stuck in his beard or whatever. And they realize he's broken his vows, and so they forsake him and leave him. I mean, they shun him, and he's disgraced. And Siddhartha sits down under a big banyan tree. It's a kind of fig tree. And basically says, none of these things have worked. And so whatever the answer is, it's not in learning something. It's not in doing something. It's not in praying something or whatever. I mean, this is going to have to be something that's going to have to be a journey within, I guess. So he sits under this tree and just goes into a deep meditation. And I'm not going to tell you the whole story of all the days that he was under the tree and the things that he goes through, but I do want to tell you just a couple of things that are important, okay? First of all, before he actually attains enlightenment, there are a number of the Hindu gods. Remember, this is Hindu culture, and everybody grows up believing in the Hindu gods. And according to the story, there are some of the Hindu gods that think that his quest is noble and would like to help him, but they can't figure out how. They can't figure out how to help him, and they're unable to. Now, the next thing is, there is another deity who is antagonistic to him and is often described as the personification of evil. But anyway, her name is Mara, and this particular deity does not want Siddhartha to attain enlightenment and tries to prevent him and cannot. And even after he attains it, tries to convince him not to tell anybody. And so this is, this is against him. So you've got gods for him that can't help him, and you've got another powerful deity against him that could not stop him and could not prevent him from attaining the enlightenment that he was seeking. The reason I'm telling you this is why that when Siddhartha is enlightened, he comes to the conclusion that the gods cannot help you on your quest to enlightenment. Because the ones that wanted to help him couldn't, and the one that wanted to prevent him couldn't. Make sense? So Siddhartha isn't saying that all of these gods the Hindus believe in don't exist. What he's basically saying is they're about this much higher than you on the food chain. They may be elusive and they may have some powers that you don't have, but they're stuck in samsara just like you are, and they can't even get themselves free. They may have some powers here. They might be able to make your corn grow or make your cow get pregnant, but they cannot help you on the path to personal enlightenment. And the second thing from this enlightenment experience I'd like you to know, and I won't talk about it after this, but it's an important aspect if you're studying other aspects of Buddhism. Siddhartha sees glimpses of all of his past lives that he's lived before. And there is a collection of these stories that is called the Jatakas, or the Jataka tales. And in the Jataka tales, again, there are stories of the Buddha's past lives that he sees in these flashes as he is being enlightened. So you might want to keep that in mind. Almost done with the story here, and we can go on and look at some more slides here. But the first thing he does when he is enlightened is he goes and he finds his 5 friends that have rejected him, and he tells them, he's found what he's looking for. And of course they're probably very hesitant at first, but after he starts speaking to them, they realize, oh my gosh, Siddhartha's, he really has found it. And so at this point, they accept him back, and they actually become his disciples. He becomes the guru, or becomes the leader of this group of 6 monks, and continues to promote these teachings, and the movement grows fairly quickly after that. Now, where he finds these 5 former friends is in a place called the Deer Park. It's outside the city of Sarnath. This is where the beginning of Buddhism really happens. Him teaching these 5 other monks his enlightenment information. I mean, this is the beginning of it. So what is it that he is teaching them then? Well, let's go on to the next slide here, and we're going to talk about these things. First of all, after he is enlightened is when he is called the Buddha. You don't call him that before that. He's just Siddhartha Gautama. Now, his last name Gautama, if I was in front of class, I'd be writing this on the board, but I'll spell it slowly. You'll see it spelled two different ways. You'll see it spelled Gautama, and you'll see it spelled Gotama. Siddhartha Gautama. And Gautama it's kind of like his last name, like I'm Steven Meigs, if you will. That's Gautama. Now, what caste is he a part of? Well, he's obviously a part of the Kshatriyas because he's the son of a king, right? So he's part of the ruling caste, the warrior caste. And he is part of a subcaste or a clan called the Shakya clan. Now, it's actually spelled S-A-K-Y-A, but sometimes over the S, you'll see like a little dot. But when you see that dot over the S, it usually means you're supposed to pronounce it as an S-H. So even though it looks like Sakya, it's really Shakya. So if you see Sakya spelled like Shakya, don't let it shock you. Anyway, Buddha means the enlightened one or the awakened one. And that's what he is often called, but he has a couple of other names. And you'll notice that one of them up here, the third line, is Shakyamuni. And it means the sage of the Shakya clan. Now, this is interesting because remember, he's a son of a king. The aristocratic ruling class is not where your sages come from. That's not where your great gurus and religious leaders come from as a rule. So it is kind of an anomaly that the son of a king would be the one who is enlightened and renounces everything. So his renunciation is something substantial because of course, the state he was born into in life. And the other one, and this is one, if you're in one of my courses that's using Fisher's book, it isn't in Fisher, but I'd like you to know it, is Tathagata. It's a play on words, if you will, and suffice to say that it is kind of a combination of one who has thus gone and one who has thus come, and sometimes in the other order. But the idea is this: if you want to just use what we call a dynamic equivalent, sometimes it is translated as truth bearer. And I think that's a good one, a bearer of truth, because he has gone where nobody has gone, and he has come back bearing this knowledge that everyone needs. And this knowledge is called the Dharma. Now, let's stop here real quickly. Two things. First of all, you see Dharma and Dhamma. We have two different ancient languages in India called Sanskrit and Pali. And so many of these words, you'll see different versions of them. So when you see two versions of a word, I've just thrown it up there because this is one of the words that you might see in Pali as much as you see it in Sanskrit. So you'll sometimes see Dharma, you'll sometimes see Dhamma. And when we get to Nirvana, you'll see that you'll also see Nibbana sometimes too. Anyway, back to Dharma, and this is very clearly a different definition of Dharma than we have in Hinduism, right? Because in Hinduism, Dharma is primarily your responsibility to fulfill your caste obligations. And as we'll find out, the Buddha rejects the whole idea of caste. Why does he do that? Well, it's not just because of the oppression of the poor or anything like that, but he's all about this search for enlightenment, for this inner peace. And he thinks anybody can attain it. I mean, he wasn't in the right kind of caste where he was supposed to be able to attain it, that's for sure. But he thinks that anybody can. And he thinks the idea that you have to labor through many, many, many lifetimes until you're finally reborn as a Brahmin, and then you can seek enlightenment and maybe, have moksha after that. He thinks that that is very, very repressive, but not just in a socioeconomic way. It's repressive in a spiritual way. You're telling people that they can't have the enlightenment that they seek, that they can't have the relief from suffering, the existential peace that they seek until after they've been reborn a few thousand more times. He completely disagrees with that. If you come to the Buddhist Sangha, a little bit farther down here, or the order of monks, and you enter there, it doesn't matter if you're the son of a king or the son of an untouchable. I mean, when you come into the Buddha's community, everyone is equal. And what you accomplish is based on what you are willing to do. Where you were born in society has nothing to do with it. Now, we mentioned briefly, talking about the Code of Manu in Hinduism, that Buddhism and Jainism really challenged the caste system and the necessity of living according to your responsibility, your varnashrama dharma. We mentioned that. So now you're actually seeing more the problem the Buddha has with it. It's not just socioeconomic, but it's spiritual repression as well. So for the Buddha, dharma obviously cannot mean varnashrama dharma. Dharma in Buddhism means something very, very different. It means basically the teaching of the Buddha. And we're going to talk more about this later, but I just presented this one word right here to give you a clue of what we're going to be talking about, and that is that there are some terms that in Buddhism are radically redefined. And just preview here, dharma, karma, reincarnation, and samadhi, radically redefined in Buddhism. Although the terms are there, they don't mean the same thing. It's important to realize that. There are some terms that mean almost the same thing, like samsara, cycle of rebirth. There are some differences, but it basically means the same thing. There are other terms in Hinduism that never even make it into Buddhism because Buddhism just has a problem with them altogether, such as Brahman and Atman. Those two terms do not figure in Buddhism at all. In fact, you'll find out in the next lecture, we're going to talk a lot about the concept of Anatman, which means not Atman. So we'll save that for then. So anyway, a lot of terms are not brought into Buddhism from Hinduism. Some are and mean kind of the same thing, but there's some really significant terms. Dharma and karma, these are significant terms. And the concept of reincarnation, also very significant, but they mean something very different in Buddhism. And we'll be talking about that in the next lecture. Sangha, the order of monks. One of the things that makes Buddhism absolutely unique among the world religions is that it begins as a monastic movement. The only other one of the major world religions, and well, some people would say this isn't major. How many people know a Jain? I don't mean a girl named Jane. I mean someone who is from the religion of Jainism. Probably not too many people do. But still it's considered a world religion because it is known all over the world, and there are Jains living all over the world. But Buddhism and Jainism, which are born in the middle of the axial age in India, are the two religions among the world religions that are actually born as monastic movements. If you want to join the Buddha's community or Mahavira's community in Jainism, you have to leave society to join the community. You can't stay in society and have any spiritual success. So it's not a lay movement, it's a monastic movement. Now, obviously today, it can't be that, or we wouldn't even know about it, right? So a lay movement certainly did develop, and there's a very broad lay movement in many forms of Buddhism today, and we'll talk more about that. But again, it begins as a monastic movement. Think about this. Everything the Buddha is telling you about who society says you are, and why you are, and what your responsibility is, and the path to enlightenment, he's telling you that it's all wrong. So, if society is telling you that you are obligated to fulfill a responsibility that is going to keep you from your spiritual progress, then you can't stay in society and be accepted in society and have any spiritual progress, can you? And that's really the way it's looked at in the beginning. You want this enlightenment we're talking about, you leave society. You leave it. And that's the only way to get free of all of the lies society tells you about who you are and why you are and what your main responsibility is. Interesting, huh? We'll talk more about that. Nirvana, or nibbana, literally means extinguishing. And this is really interesting, by the way. We're going to talk about it in the next video. It may be maybe the deepest video all semester. So fasten your seatbelts. Extinguishing of what? Well, first of all, of desire, of craving, of hope, of expectations, of whatever you get attached to that causes existential suffering. This is what we're going to talk about in the next video. But ultimately, the reason you get attached to things is because the way they affect your idea of who you are or yourself. And so the only way to really get free of the desires you're attached to or the expectations you're attached to is to get free of your idea of self that you're attached to. And accepting the fact that your whole idea of who you are is illusory. And we're going to talk about, again, in the next video, we're going to talk about that. It's very interesting. So extinguishing, nirvana is liberation, whether you talk about it in this life or the next life. Remember we talked about the already or the not yet before. Nirvana can refer to an enlightenment in this life. It can also refer to the final extinguishing when your life is over. And we'll talk more about that as well. So in this life, if you have an experience of nirvana, and sometimes there are other terms for an experience of enlightenment while you're still alive in various forms of Buddhism, but that would result, of course, in a liberation from existential suffering while you're still alive. But ultimately, nirvana, the final extinguishing, is resulting in liberation from samsara. And we'll talk a lot more about that. Talked about the first sermon. The middle way is an easy thing for me to cover really quickly, and then the next lecture we're going to be talking about the Four Noble Truths. The middle way is the way between indulgence, or you might say, sometimes people say passion, and asceticism. What the Buddha realized is, of course, being in the most fortunate situation doesn't help you to enlightenment. I mean, he felt it was necessary to leave that when he had no luck trying to discover anything about the mystery of suffering or how to escape it while he was still in his role as a crown prince. He had to leave that. And so the ideal situation was the least ideal. But also, he went into severe asceticism, and as you know, it almost killed him and didn't help him at all. So he thinks a middle way is a lot better. And this is a way where you let your body have what it needs so that you can be healthy physically, mentally. You need to have your faculties in good enough shape to where you can push through towards this goal for enlightenment. But you don't embrace anything that you don't really need. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that when we get, 2 videos from now, and we start talking about the nature of Theravada. We're going to talk a lot about this idea of the middle way and how the monks live. They're not sleeping on a bed of nails or wearing burlap, or, they're not trying to hurt themselves at all, but they are denying themselves many, if not most, of the comforts of this life, because those things are counterproductive. They get in the way of your spiritual goal. You get attached to them. You start expecting them. And again, we're going to talk more about this 2 videos from now. Okay. The Four Noble Truths we are going to talk about in the next video. So first off, I want to talk very briefly about the form of Buddhism that we're talking about now. So the last thing I need to talk about. And we're not going to get into the different forms of Buddhism until the second video after this one. But right now, when we talk about, in the next video, the understanding of the Buddha in terms of the Four Noble Truths and the way it's understood, the form of Buddhism today that is the closest to the original understanding of the Buddha and his first couple generations of disciples is a form of Buddhism called Theravada. And if you just flip ahead another 4 or 5 pages in your outline here, you'll see the word Theravada. It looks like Theravada because it starts with a TH. Theravada. And this form of Buddhism, the reason it is the closest to the understanding of the Buddha's early disciples is simply because they tried not to change. Now, over 2,500 years, everything changes, but obviously you're going to change a lot less if you're really trying not to change, and they're really trying not to change. One of the things that they didn't want is, over the history of Buddhism, many other forms of Buddhism added many other sacred scriptures after the Buddha's life. Theravada would not. The Buddha's teachings while he was on earth and the investigation of those teachings are the only thing that they are very much concerned with. And in their scriptures called the Tripitaka, the 3 baskets, as we'll talk about later, this is what we're going to see, is the early teachings of the Buddha. Now, other forms of Buddhism we'll talk about later on. Again, 2, 3 videos after this one, we're going to get into all the different kinds of Buddhism. But for now, I want you to know we're talking about Theravada when we talk about these ideas that I've been mentioning now, but that we're going to talk about in depth in the next lecture. And again, this is going to be a deep lecture, so watch it without a whole bunch of distractions, and you'll get the most out of it. And by the way, you don't have to be a Buddhist. You do not have to be religious at all to really get something beneficial out of the next lecture. It can really, really help you in life to have a lot less existential suffering, unless, of course, you like existential suffering and anxiety and torment, in which case, don't listen to any of it. Just skip the video. I think that's all that we've got for this one here. The next video, we're going to talk about the Four Noble Truths, and I will see you then.